very much for coming and welcome to the second episode of this year's series of What Economists Really Do. I'm Banu Pakel. I'm an associate professor in the economics department and associate head for external engagement. We are especially excited about today's episode, which is generously sponsored by ECB Financial Group as part of their commitment to making economic research more accessible to the public. And we are very happy today to share with them their commitment to making economic research more impactful and accessible to everyone. Okay, I'm not gonna speak too much. We have a full agenda today. We are gonna kick off with an insightful keynote by my colleague, Associate Professor Andrea Chiavari. So he's going to tell us about how emissions affect different sectors differently, and what the implication is for social cost of carbon and policy making, such as the design of cap and trade system. After his keynote, he will be joined by David Barrett from EBC Financial Group and Dr. Nicola Ranger from the Resilient Planet Finance Lab for an exciting panel discussion on probably one of the most pressing questions we have right now, which is whether we can grow the economy while also saving our planet. And we're going to end with a Q&A session. We'll be collecting questions here as well as online. For those of you who are joining online, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions. Okay, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Andrea for his keynote.
Thank you, Banu. Lovely. Hello, everyone. As Banu said, I'm Andrea. I see some familiar faces. For the rest of you, happy to meet you. So today we are going to talk about macroeconomics and climate. So let me say how I stage this talk. So first, we know climate change poses significant challenges to our societies. Today we are going to look at a particular angle, which is the economic cost of climate change. And we try to understand how macroeconomic science can help us inform cost-effective policies to tackle this new phenomenon that we are facing. So for the sake of the conversation of today, I thought we have generous time, so we go for a small warm-up of basic facts and sort of to understand and be on the same page why we are here even talking about climate change and macroeconomics. Then we see how macroeconomists think about climate change. And in particular, we will spend a lot of time, or most of the time, thinking about what is this social cost of carbon, what does it tell us? And then we go and see how we measure it and what kind of implication it has for policy. Okay? So as I said, warm-up. So a bunch of basic facts. So this is the global GDP by world region since the Industrial Revolution, measured in trillions of dollars. And this, in a sense, tells you what has happened to our economies since 19th century. We had large amount of exponential growth that brought us today at more than 120 trillions. GDP is the most basic measure we have of human well-being, or at least the well-being our societies can deliver to us. And what you can see is that GDP has increased dramatically. There are other ways you can see through this, and this is again, since the Industrial Revolution, so it's a bit of economic history detour, what has happened to the fraction of people living in extreme poverty. So this is the World Bank definition, people living with less than $2 per day, okay, adjusted over time. So as you can see, looking for the average of the world, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we had more than 80% of people living in extreme poverty. And this has plumbed to less than 10%, okay? So what has happened since the Industrial Revolution? There was a huge increase in economic well-being fostered by productivity growth and our economies that has translated in many more metrics. So I will give last two and then we go to climate change. but many more metrics on how economists have achieved many successes since the Industrial Revolution. So here is the life expectancy at birth, again, since the beginning of 19th century to nowadays. So if you were born at the beginning of 19th century, your life expectancy at birth was around 30, 35. And now it has increased dramatically, above 60 for every country in the world. It's around 70 for the world on average, and in most advanced economies is above 80, to the point that now aging is becoming a problem of our societies. And you can see a similar picture looking at child mortality. So this is the fraction of children that were expected to die by age 5. And you can see that since the 19th century, it went from 30% to approximately 0% for most countries in the world. So these are dramatic successes that our economists, coupled with science, managed to achieve in the last 200 years. And of course, not only this did not come for free, this was a huge effort of our societies, but we started to learn more and more that this had some unintended consequences that we have started to appreciate in the last 40 and 50 years or so, although it started much early. And is that most of this extreme increase in well-beings produced by our economies, for most, have been sustained by extensive use of energies that have been generated by fossil fuels. Okay? So just to have a sense, so this is the global fossil fuel consumption for the three main sources, which are coal, oil, and gas. Again, since 19th century in terawatt hours. And as you can see, this has increased dramatically, again, exponentially, in a fashion that is very similar to the evolution of GDP. Why? Because this is exactly part of the inputs that went into the fostering of this GDP growth that we have seen in our first slide. Now, per se, this is not so interesting if it's not for the fact that fossil fuels have a side consequences that they release in our atmosphere greenhouse gases. And I'm going to show you the evolution of one particular prominent greenhouse gas, which is CO2. And again, small historical detour. This is for different countries in the world. And that's for the world per se. And you can see that these are the yearly tons of CO2 thrown into the atmosphere. We were at a good zero produced by our economies. We are at 35 billions per year. Okay, so this is the dramatic increase in CO2 emissions. And this has, important implications for our weather, for our climate, because, well, these are called greenhouse gases not by chance, but because they have greenhouse effects. So they are cooking us up, and that's how to see it, okay? So this is the monthly average surface temperature by year for the world. What does it mean? So these are the 12 months of the year, and this is the average temperature the world has for each month, okay? So you see it has a bell-shaped curve, and this is just because in summer is hotter, in winter is cooler. And here you can see from 1955 until 2024. In dark, we have the last year. What is happening is that every month of the year is becoming hotter and hotter by the years. Of course, there are small variations on average, but this is a very clear long trajectories. And this is what we call climate change, okay? In a nutshell. So far, what I told you is what brought us here, but most of this, it's climate science. So it should be the talk given to you by a natural scientist. There are many here at Christchurch, less at the Department of Economics. I belong to the Department of Economics as well, so let me tell you how all this fits back in our economies. What are the costs of this? How do we think about it? And what are the policy implications, okay? So how macroeconomists think about climate change. So the way we think about climate change has been pioneered by William Nordhaus in his work in the 1970s onward, which recently in 2018 got recognized a Nobel Prize for integrated climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis. And this is the success of William Nordhaus in shaping our way of thinking, because he really took the off-the-shelf, our long-run way of thinking about economics. And in particular, he took, so let me give one slide on this, the standard neoclassical growth model, which is the way macroeconomists think about long-run questions, which can be summarized in its production side by this equation. So this equation is nothing fancy. It just tells you how we think about aggregate output, okay? And we think it to be the byproduct of productivity and a bundle of inputs. Inputs are those things used in production. Think about capital, machineries, buildings. Think about labor, all the workers used by the firms. Think about energy, the one we saw before, okay? We bundle this in an aggregate production function times the productivity a country has. So countries that have similar amount of inputs can have widely different output because they can have different productivity, large differences in productivity and technologies they use. And so they will have large differences in output. This is so far, it's a long tradition in macroeconomics. What Nordhaus did with his integrated assessment models is to add a very parsimonious, a very elegant twist to this, which goes a great deal in understanding the effect on climate and through that the implications for policies and disciplining our thinking, which is just adding this term here, okay? So realizing that the aggregate productivity with which the economy operates may depend on many things, institutional factor, the legal system, the available set of technologies, but also may depend on the way weather interact with our economic agents. And this is what we call the aggregate damage function. And in a sense, the way you can think about it is as climate becomes more extreme, as temperature rises, productivity may decline. And this implies that we may have aggregate output losses out of that. And this is just recognizing a lot of work done at the very granular level by many scientists that extreme weather events, higher temperature have physiological impacts on the workforce, increase injuries at work, absenteeism, breaks machineries, lithium batteries cannot work up to a certain temperature, it reduces the yield of crops, and so on and so forth. So all these things here are captured through this parsimonious function here that relates temperature with the productivity our economy deliver output with. Okay? Why is it so central? Because these reshape all the policy implications of this class of models. Why? Well, because in standard models, as much as in real life, whenever you go to the market to buy energy, you just pay a market price P. Okay? So what is this? This is the price you face when trading off how much energy do you want to use. On the one hand, well, what is your benefit? You get a warmer room, a warmer office. What is your cost? You pay the price of your energy bill. And you choose your optimal amount of energy or how much to turn on your radiator based on these two considerations. Well, this is different in integrated assessment models. Not as much about your own decision making, but about how your own decision making affects social costs. Why? Because in a world with climate change, where climate change has negative implications for our economy, your action is slightly more subtle than that. You are still trading off between the price you pay and your benefits of having a warmer room, but you're not internalize a key concept, which is the fact that whenever you turn on your radiator, you not only pay the cost by yourself of your energy bill, but you pay or you impose to society one extra cost, which is the fact that higher energy bill means higher energy means higher emissions, and higher emissions means larger climate change, which means larger cost for the economy. These things you don't take into account, first because they're not priced in your energy bill, and second because you are marginal. Look, your impact on aggregate climate change whenever you turn on your radiator is zero. But the fact that us together as a society don't internalize this feedback because it's not priced in our energy bill, it means that we collectively are going to consume much more energy than society would like to. And so we will impose much more climate change and a much broader cost. And how we summarize this is through the social cost of carbon. Okay? So in a nutshell, one definition is estimated cost in pounds of burning 1 extra ton of carbon in the atmosphere. Okay? And you can see it through this very simple equation. So E in this case are emissions. So what is the effect of burning 1 extra ton of emissions, in this case carbon? How much do they lower output? And since we want to recover a cost, this is a negative ratio, so we put a minus in front of it, and this is the total cost, okay? Very good. But again, I promise you that this at the heart of this, there will be this aggregate damage function, and all goes around this. So how do we see this? Well, let me unpack the social cost of carbon in a sort of causal chain, okay? From emissions to output. This is can be summarized in 3 objects, okay? In a very, very simplified way. So let me start from the third object. This is the link between emissions and temperature, okay? This is climate science. This is a fact, and this is something we, as macroeconomists, we are happily, we're happy to borrow from climate scientists, okay? So this is something that we can introduce in our models out of what scientists tell us, which is the link between emission and technologies, and this is climate change in a sense. The second component, which is the first for the sake of this explanation, is the relation between changes in aggregate productivity, in the productivity of our economies, and changes in output, okay? This is 50 years of macroeconomic business when we think about long-run outcome, okay? From Bob Solow onward, this is something we're very confident about, okay? So in a sense, you immediately see that if I want to understand the social cost of carbon, I'm quite confident about 1 and 3 for different reasons. What I need to understand is this missing link, which is the relation between changes in climate change, and changes in the productivity of our economies. And this is the beauty of this integrated assessment models, is fully summarized by the aggregate damage function. Okay? Very good. So let me try to, in a nutshell, summarize why we are so happy about this concept and why we use it so much, why it is so central for us. By itself, this summarizes the social cost of emissions, okay? The private cost is summarized by the market price. How much is costly for an economy to produce energy? That is summarized by the market price. This summarizes instead the cost for society of not internalizing the emission chain. And this has come as sort of a bonus that once you are confident that you can try to measure this, you can pinpoint to the entire social cost of carbon. And again, remember, prices they represent the market value of producing energy, okay, given demand and supply. So this is they inform you on the cost of producing energy. This instead informs you on the cost of polluting the planet through using energies. This is not in the market. This is why private agents fail to internalize the cost of climate change. But there is an easy fix from economists, which is it's enough to tax the social cost of carbon, to let agents internalize what is the social cost of their actions. And why is that the case? Well, think again yourself, turning on the radiator, your benefit is the same as before, having a warmer room, okay? But now your cost is much higher than before. Before you were paid the energy price, and once you have carbon taxation, you pay the energy price plus the cost of the emissions you are imposing to society. You are fully paying the cost you are imposing to society. And this is very comfy because, in a sense, you need to just to know what is this number. You can engineer a tax and then let the private sector, through incentives, work out what is the optimal solution of society. So let me just share some thought about carbon taxation before going and how we measure it, what is the number, and compared to what we see around the world. So does it mean that imposing carbon taxes mean we need to sacrifice our standard of living? Because this is the great trade-off we face. We achieve a lot with economic growth. We don't want to give it up for climate change. No, we are going to face the cost of climate change, today or later. Most likely later, but we are going to face them. We're not going to escape them. This allows us to internalize the value of our action and make decisions fully aware of what the climate change will impose on our society. But this comes with a bunch of bonus. So yes, bonus is a word I like a lot. Think about what does it do, carbon taxation. Carbon taxation taxes carbon, doesn't tax energy. So it creates huge incentives for the private sector, for people, for you, for us, for me, to move from fossil fuels to alternative source of energy. Okay, so it's not just reducing energy, reducing output, but create huge incentives to switch towards alternative energy sources. It has the power of redirect incentives, at least to a certain extent, towards green innovation. So why we see less green innovation than we would like now is because brown technologies are very profitable because they're not taxed, they're true cost. The true cost takes into account the social cost of carbon. Once you tax them, green innovation are much more profitable. And this can help, and I mean, we will talk afterward, but it can help the private sector to direct toward green innovations, can allow investors, scientists, and everyone to focus on the things that have the highest value for society. And that this last part, which is surprisingly overlooked, mostly by policymakers, well, it generates revenues. Okay, it's a tax, it generates revenues, which can be used. It's not my point to say you how, but, well, you can use revenues. If you think carbon taxation is regressive, you can use the revenues to counteract the effect of regressive taxation or the weaker part of society. So this is kind of the theoretical overlook. So I promise to my colleagues to be fast, so I will jump immediately into the measurement, okay? So to understand the measurement, we need to understand how we think about the aggregate damage function and where it comes from. So the aggregate damage function, most of it originates where when production takes place, which is in the firms, okay? And it has so there are different channels through which climate change can affect firms. So the most obvious one is the direct effect that it has on the firms. A hotter weather, more extreme events make firms less productive. In agriculture, they lower the yield of crops. In manufacturing or services, they work the productivity of the workforce. They increase dizziness, they increase injuries at work, they have physiological impact of workers, they increase absenteeism. We have all evidence of this. On the machinery side, we have machineries overheating, or you need to switch off your machineries not to break them, and some machineries, particularly in the industrial sector, takes days to be turned on again. So all these things are productivity effects that firms may face directly out of climate change. But then there is another set of effects which we call indirect effects, which is how can firms react to these direct effects, and if not, how much is it an extra cost to them? And the way to think is the following. Imagine that climate change affects some areas of a country or some areas of the world relative to the other. One way that the economy has through market mechanisms to react to climate change is to shift its input into other units of production where climate change is less devastating, okay? So you move from most affected areas to least affected areas. So you move your inputs, could be materials, could be labor, could be capital, away from climate change bites the most. And if this doesn't happen, well, this is an extra cost whereby our economies have a lot of inputs stuck in the wrong, least productive place, okay? Very good. So how do we measure these things? Well, we use Italy, perhaps because I'm Italian, but this came out of a research we did. And this has we have very good firm level data that can be coupled with this data from the European Union, where we have very granular information about the weather. So for you that know the country, so these small black areas, these are provinces that are very small areas of Italy. So we have information about the weather at a much more granular level. This is 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. So we can partition cities. And this shows you the amount of variety or amount of difference in temperature that we can exploit to understand what is the effect on two quasi-identical firms, one having a temperature shock, the other not. Looking at the difference of two identical firms, one facing a temperature shock and the other not, allows us to understand what is the potential effect of extreme weather events, comparing these two groups. And so we can use them, and then we can use the different outcome of our different effects that we were talking before. So the first pass we can do is to look at the impact of extreme weather events on the productivity, so our direct effect. We can measure productivity in the data. So on the x-axis here we have temperature intervals. Okay, so what does it mean? This is the number of days that a small cell has between 0 and 30, between 31 and 35, above 40. And the y-axis summarizes the productivity loss, the annual productivity loss for one firm moving 1 day from the 0 to 30 benchmark bin, that's why it's 0, to, for example, 1 day above 40. Okay, so if you just increase 1 day above 40 relative to the average temperature, what you have is that for that firm, productivity goes down by minus 0.35%. Just 1 day above 40 lowers productivity by 0.35%. So 10 days above 40 compared to normal would lower productivity by 3.5%. Okay, so this is a huge number if you consider this is just for one form for a bunch of days. What climate change will do, it will change the entire distribution, okay, of temperature toward extreme temperature realizations. So in a sense, just to summarize, this tells you that the direct effects are expected to be large at the micro level on the firms. How do we go after the indirect effects? So now we understand that a firm that is affected by an extreme weather event, so extreme temperatures, will have much lower productivity, and we can look what it does to its inputs. Will it send the inputs away towards less affected locations, or it will be constrained to keep them? Okay? And to see this, we look again at the temperature intervals. And here now we have inputs reduction in percent. Okay? And we consider 3 inputs. There are 3 major inputs used in production. So it's material, this I think is blue, labor red, and capital green. Okay? So what you can see is that materials and labor reduce a lot in a similar fashion to productivity. So what it means is that when a firm is hit by an extreme weather event, it lowers productivity, or it faces a lower productivity, and it lowers the demand for materials and labor. This does not happen to capital, which means that this firm will be stuck with more capital than it would like to have. So there will be a lot of capital that will be stuck in least productive location. And this is intuitive because capital is the least flexible input among these. It's very difficult to move machineries. It's near impossible to move structures. You need to leave them there to get depreciated and build new ones in other areas. And in a sense, the ability of an economy to do so, it's the ability to overcome this indirect effect, and for capital is very difficult. Okay? So we see that both indirect and direct effects have important, potentially huge bites on the cost for firms. So what we do then is we aggregate them up, and we find this aggregate damage function. So now the axes are a bit different, so let me explain you how we do. So these are how many degrees relative to normal. So you can think this is the extent of climate change, okay? So if I have 1 extra degree more, if I have 2 extra degree more, and so on and so forth. For example, and this is the aggregate productivity loss. So now it's aggregate losses in percent. So take 2 degrees Celsius increase. This is not a very likely event, but it's not unlikely anymore. This lowers aggregate productivity by 1.68%. And this is highly convex. So the more extreme the realization of climate change, the larger is going to be the productivity losses. Okay? So this is the fundamental ingredient in the model. So let me help you to see through this. So what does this say about the social cost of carbon, carbon taxation? Well, we need to put a bit more structure, but in a sense, if you take a 2 degrees Celsius increase, you have a 1.68 decline in aggregate productivity. This translates in a GDP loss of approximately 5.61% forever. For you, this is more or less 2,000 pounds out of your pocket per year. Okay? Translating this. So if you add some extra assumptions, so this is a bit of a back of the envelope calculation, but you use a 2% discount rate, you find a social cost of carbon that goes from 90 pounds to 180 pounds. Okay? So this is a wide interval. I don't want to overstress our confidence on that, but on one thing it's very clear. This is much higher than what we see nowadays. Okay? This is much higher than what the Treasury of the US reports in the report that they consider the social cost of carbon. This is much higher than what the European Union, through their emission trading schemes, are imposing as a cost of carbon. Okay? Very good. So in a sense, it tells you that it's very useful because it gives you a sense of where you want to go. For the later discussion, I think there is some room and space for improvement. So let me conclude here. So unprecedented level of well-being. Foremost, have been fueled by CO2 heavy energy sources, and this has caused climate change. This is a fact. But macroeconomic model provides a lot of guidance on cost-effective policies to counteract. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It was a very interesting and insightful talk, and he answered a lot of questions, but also left with us with many questions. Hopefully we can discuss some of them during the panel. So let me invite our panelists to the table. Okay, so the aim of the panel is to answer this big question, whether it's possible to grow the economy while ensuring sustainability. And we are joined by, we are very lucky to have 3 panelists with slightly different backgrounds, obviously, who will be able to give us their diverse views on the topic. So let me start with introducing our panelists. So Andrea now requires no introductions after the keynote. So Andrea Chiavari is a macroeconomist whose research focuses on firm dynamics, technological progress, as well as climate change. And probably during the panel, he will build on his keynote, but also will share with us his view on how economic research can better inform policymaking. And next to Andrea is Dr. Nicola Ranger, who is the director of the Resilient Planet Finance Lab. Nicola is also doing research, macro research on climate change. So her research explores the role of finance and policy in addressing various challenges, including climate change in more vulnerable regions of the world. So she will speak right after Andrea and before David. So she will serve as a bridge between research, policy, and financial sector, obviously connecting insights from her research to the practical role of the financial sector in fostering resilience. And on the other side of Nicola is Mr. David Barrett, who is the director of EBC, CEO, and chief risk officer. David has extensive experience and expertise in foreign exchange, fixed income commodities, derivatives, and CFDs. With such unique combination of expertise, he will shed light on how the financial sector has been adopting, or maybe not adopting, a little bit of spoiler, to climate-aware investment and how the sector is trading off profitability and sustainability. Okay, thank you very much for coming to Oxford and joining us. I'm going to start with Andrea. Based on the most recent research, what are the most significant gaps between our beautiful, shiny models and real policy making when it comes to sustainable growth?
This is a very interesting question. I think you asked 10 economists and you get 10 different questions. So I'll give you my questions on this. I think the part that we need to understand is that new technologies will play a crucial role. Like we can tax carbon, this lowers emissions, let us internalize the cost that markets don't manage alone. But how costly will be to tax carbon and the cost of climate change and avoiding it will depend on the technologies that will be available. So for us, understanding how carbon taxation shape the profit incentives of the private sector to develop new technologies is the most difficult part, because it interacts with probably one of the most complicated research questions, which is like how to understand human creativity and what the smartest people in the world will do in the next 10, 15 years to deliver us technologies, one with fixed prices, in a way that those technologies will be profitable. So I think those things will be fundamental to understand what is going to be the cost of climate change, and then how to sell climate policies, because potentially there are huge benefits that it's hard to fit in our model at this stage.
Do you think as economists or academic economists at least, are we doing a good job in informing policy, or can we do better?
I guess the answer is you can always do better. But I think the friction is that for politicians they have to sell a tax to people, and so we are selling the the most cost-effective answer. How to sell it to the people? I guess there is huge room for economists interested in interaction between politics, voting systems, and how to sell things. Then I think there is room for that. Yes.
Okay, so you already answered my next question. So you think the biggest barrier is then being able to make these policies a little more political friendly as well?
Yes. So one is that we are selling a tax, so we are selling a loss. It can be very concentrated to some small group of societies, but there are, for example, like some big corporations that are polluting, but there is some concern that this can also be regressive because the energy consumption basket is very tiny for rich people. It's very large for the most fragile chunks of society. So understanding this is very important. And I think the other big frictions for policymakers is that this must be a global solution. Like there is no country that can act alone. If the United Kingdom goes alone and brings emission to zero, it will have no impact on climate change and will be extremely costly for the United Kingdom. And the sad part is that we are seeing a world that is becoming more and more insular, more and more fragmented due to geopolitical situations that have nothing to do with climate change. But given that the same players have to agree on climate change, I think this is a huge challenge ahead of us.
Okay, thank you very much. And Nicola, so you've done a lot of work on macroeconomics of climate change as well as understanding natural risks. So what are the linkages between the two?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. Before I get on to the subject of nature, I want to start with a couple of reflections, if I may, and also to start with one is a confession and then maybe a provocation. So the confession is, so 20 years ago I was running integrated assessment models. So 20 years ago I was working in Treasury for the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change and running integrated assessment models to try to work out at that time what are the costs of climate change and where should we stabilize. So this was long before we had the commitments to 1.5 degrees. Where should we try to stabilize our emissions? What are the right policy mixes to go there? Is it taxes versus quantities? You know, all of these questions. So that's my first confession. My second confession is after going to the LSE, after that to London School of Economics, spent a lot of time in policy trying to implement this. Spent a lot of time working in international negotiations, spent a lot of time working with financial institutions, and then back to Oxford.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I guess my provocation then is so you started your presentation with Nordhaus's Nobel Prize. I think Nordhaus actually set us back a long way. So I feel, so a lot of my work is around estimating the costs of climate change and also the links with nature as well. Mm-hmm. And certainly those early numbers that Nordhaus was coming out with were incredibly low. Yeah. And even 20 years ago when we were working on the Stern Review, doing sort of syntheses of this evidence and running our own models, there was a lot of understanding at that point around all the things that were missing in those numbers and all of the challenges that come through using an aggregate damage function. And this is true for policy, but it's even more true for if you're trying to make decisions in a particular country like the UK, for example.
And probably parameters that we would have no way informing with the data, so that was a big problem as well.
Yeah, it was a big problem, and I think that for those of you that haven't followed this area, so some of the early numbers were coming out, and the problem that was back at that time was the numbers of the costs of climate change, the physical impacts of climate change were much lower than the estimates of the costs of acting on climate change, and it's because of the way we were estimating the aggregate damage functions. And we knew from talking to the scientific community that there were big things that were being missed. And to give you a few examples, so a lot of the evidence, for example, is backward looking. So as we saw here from your research, and I should say, I think, so now I work with financial institutions, the type of research you do is actually really relevant, and maybe we can come back to that for financial institutions. But the big problem is the future of climate change will not look like the past. So I would argue that you cannot have an aggregate damage function just based on the past without thinking about how the future will look different. And particularly, we talk about structural changes in the energy system, but climate change will lead to massive structural changes in our food systems, in our infrastructure systems. And you cannot model that by just looking behind. You have to be thinking forward and looking at models and projections of the forward view. And so we underestimate through looking backwards. How a firm is reacting on a year-to-year basis tells us very little about how it's going to look 10, 20, 30 years forward in these big macro changes that we expect to see. And those early damage function didn't capture that. And it led to some really big policy challenges because the whole narrative became, the costs aren't that big. And it took a long time. It took years and years and years and years of research that tried to build a more comprehensive picture of what the risks were to change that narrative. And actually we're still having to fight that battle on a daily basis. And just to sort of come back to, and I'd love to talk more about the prices versus quantities, because as an economist, the price approach, totally agree, is the most efficient. But in the real world, for various reasons that you've explained, just has been almost impossible to implement. And we've had to go back to sort of second best approaches. And I'd love to hear your view on this. One of the most effective ones at the moment was the IRA in the US. So this was the Inflation Reduction Act. So I thought this was really interesting because for years and years and years, economists have been arguing about how do you get the price just right. And then the US just comes along and just dumps 100 trillion subsidies and there you go, done. So which led to a lot of interesting action. So I'd love to talk more about that. But just coming back to the point on nature. So one of the big feedbacks that's missing in a lot of this is actually how our natural world responds to this. Because what's also happening at climate change is that it's impacting our natural world, it's impacting our forests, it's impacting our land use, etc., etc. And that creates a feedback. And you might have seen in the news that actually this year was the last year the first year when there was no net carbon absorption by the natural world. And it was because of the forest fires increasing and things like that. And that will accelerate everything. So the fact that we don't take into account those feedbacks is a big problem.
So another thing that we are not, probably until recently at least, not taking into account in our models was this complementarities. So if a lot of people, so this path dependence, complementarities, when many agents do this, so the prices will go down. So more and more agents will start switching to renewable energy and so on. So leaving aside all the issues related to measurement, so what is the right price, how can we quantify risks and everything, even if we knew the numbers right, what would be the role of the financial sector, for instance, in this picture?
Well, the financial sector plays an absolutely critically important role. So, firstly, the fact that we're still investing in fossil fuels, in financial institutions are making those investments. So we need to sort of shift away from those. But actually, we also need finance to help those sectors to transition, because we need an energy infrastructure, and actually the energy sector has the expertise to do that. So if we can transition, that's a good approach. So we need financial institutions to be in the game supporting that transition. But we also need the financing of the solutions as well, the renewable energy technologies and things. And around the world it's estimated that between sort of 2.4 trillion of investment is needed every year to support this transition. So financial institutions have to be part of that. But as we were discussing earlier, we need the policymakers to set the right frameworks to create the incentives, of which prices are a really important part of that.
Definitely.
So today is the Finance Day at the UN Climate Conference. What do you expect to come out of it?
What do I expect or what do I want?
As you wish.
what we as a world, shall we say, are hoping for is a new commitment on finance to come out of the negotiations, hopefully today, but at least by the end of next week when it finishes. So the new collective quantified goal on finance is the big thing that is the big finance goal that we're trying to get. So we previously had a commitment to 100 billion a year, but recognise now that that's nowhere near what we need. So the big hope is that negotiators will get a new agreement. There's also been some things already happen related to finance. So the Article 6, which is around carbon markets, there was a new set of rules approved on the first day. There was a lot of complaints that perhaps that wasn't as consultative as it could have been, but at least there's now some rules, and that will help finance to flow as well.
And so there's a question, so I know we will do Q&A later, but this is actually related to the next question I was going to ask. So what do you think we can do as researchers, economic researchers, to change the incentives or the way the policymakers think? Do you think there's a role for us?
I think an absolutely critical role, which is one of the reasons I came back to academia, because that there are so many gaps that financial institutions the academic institutions need to fill. So, the research that you showed at the firm level, for example, so we do a lot of work with financial institutions where they need to be engaging with their clients to help them to transition and adapt. So that sort of firm level analysis, and actually I work a lot on the physical impacts of climate change and how we can help firms to adapt. So exactly that type of evidence is essential to be able to provide advice for financial institutions to support their clients. And actually, we've had conversations in Italy where they've been crying out for exactly that type of analysis, so that banks can be saying to their clients, how can we support you to be building your resilience to these types of events?
Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. And David.
I feel like a target waiting to be shot here. Yeah.
So, how do you think the financial institutions, say in the UK, are adapting their investment strategies to prioritize sustainability and climate resilience?
Okay, so taking your cue, I'll start with a confession as well.
Oops.
So I am 37 years in the market now, working at various tier 1 type banking institutions, doing all kinds of stuff. I would say I'm now less optimistic about what it produces and how it interacts with the rest of the world than probably I've ever been. And I have been part of that problem because I've been working in that field for 37 odd years. I think the reality is that the financial market is not listening to what you're telling it. Financial market is driven by the need to make money, whether that's for its shareholder or whether for its investor. And the thing you have to appreciate is that all investment, whether it's private equity, whether it's banks, hedge funds, private offices, any of them, they're all there to earn a return and get their money back. The UK is no different from anywhere else. The city has spent the last 10 years looking at ESG. It started off as a very pure topic and a product that could really help an investor focus what it wanted to do with its money and how it wanted to utilise that. And it's been completely hijacked, and it's what financial markets do. Financial markets are driven by the need to make money, and the investors that put that money in are driven by the need to make money out of their investment as well. And ESG is a classic example of you set some rules, you set some benchmarks and some post points that qualify an investment product that you structure for your client to be ESG compatible. So the client comes along and says, I want to be more ethically invested in X, Y, and Z. The biggest tool that you could give the financial market is rules. Financial market loves rules because rules allow the financial market to skirt rules and to get around them. And ESG is the perfect example. We took a pure product that was developed out of conversations from your sphere of the world, and people were beginning to realise and understand that something needed to be done and they wanted to be part of it. ESG isn't that. It's a tick box exercise that's grown exponentially in terms of the assets under management, because they'll sell anything that will produce fees. And it's been completely corrupted. And I think the problem that you have with the financial market is don't expect it to help. It'll only help when it's incentivized to do it. And it comes back to the earlier conversation we had where policy needs to be much better at educating the voter about what it wants and how it should expect that to come about. Financial markets will not do it on their own.
So do you think the incentives should come from downstream? So maybe it will start from consumers, so value the products of greener firms, and that will give an incentive to firms to change their behavior, and then the financial sector will find it more profitable to
absolutely. So the good thing about the financial sector, there are some good things, believe it or not, but the good thing about the financial sector is that once you point it in the direction and once you get its enthusiasm on a topic, it can do amazing things, and it will do them incredibly quickly. So in terms of implementing some of these changes and helping fund the innovation, fund things that can make a difference, a real difference, and move the needle, the financial market can do that, but it needs to have the incentive to do it. And I sadly think that it's not going to do it on its own, and it needs to come from politics. We had a conversation earlier about...
So stick, not carrot.
100%, yeah.
Okay.
100%. Again, if you expect the financial market to do something out of the goodness of its heart, you're going to be a long time waiting, because it just doesn't work that way. Sorry.
I'm now speechless. I don't know what to ask.
I think the thing we had a conversation.
Tell us something positive. Are there potential solutions, or just
I think the positive message is that if you guys can convince policymakers, and more importantly, I think the voters that put them into office, that this is real and it needs to be done, you use the stick and carrot. Like recent innovations in technology, finance can be incredibly innovative. It can find ways to solve problems, move mountains, build things, develop access to things incredibly quickly and incredibly powerfully. But you need to give it a reason to do that. And I think, personally, the rotating sort of political event doesn't help that. Nobody's being honest. Nobody has a macro thought in them anymore. All of the things that you guys have talked about are things that need to, and I agree with you, it needs to be forward-looking, but it needs to be done in a way where people are accepting of that they're not talking about the next election cycle, they're talking about the next 2 or 3 decades worth of pain and thought and direction and attrition on the subject. Nobody thinks macro anymore. Everybody wants instant gratification, and this isn't a topic that's solved by that.
May I just add on a point on that? Because I think, so I totally agree on the instant gratification part.
Again, I apologise.
Totally agree. And I think, so there was a presentation, I think it might have been at the COP last year by Kristalina Georgieva, who's currently the managing director of the IMF. And she was talking about how money always flows downhill. So it takes the easy path towards
it's like
returns.
water.
It is
Absolutely.
like water.
Correct. Yep.
It flows downhill. And at the moment, if you look at the incentives that are on it, so what do we have? We have massive subsidies going into fossil fuels and much less going into the renewables. So what's happening? The water, the money is all flowing towards the fossil fuels. So you need to sort of reset the balance so the water flows in the other direction. It's pretty simple, actually, in many ways.
And I'm telling you...
That's the interesting part, right? So it's going that way because returns are high because everyone sees them riskier. So the way financial sector works, so the very nature of it, is making things much harder to change.
But, and this is why I mentioned the IRA, and I know a lot of economists hate the IRA, but the Inflation Reduction
Act. I hate it more.
But one of the things I really liked about this, so I spend a lot of time working with governments, is that when the US declared they were going to do this, I heard 2 things. So I heard both European and our own UK governments going, all the money's going to flow to the US. How are we going to respond to this? We need our own green stimulus. And I heard all the financial institutions going, now it's time. And all starting to flow towards the US. So you could see within minutes of the announcement.
It's driven by animal instincts, right? They will go where that water is easier to flow. They're not interested in creating a benefit for man that's going to cost them. They'll aid the benefit for man, and they'll aid it in a way with power and direction that nothing else can do.
Hence the need for a state.
You need to incentivize them, right? And again, I would say the positive message I would give you is that they can help, but if you don't make them help you, they won't help you. But they really have the power to do that if they think that they'll do well out of it.
And you think there's a big role for research, but for that, so I mean, probably one of the most important things is communication, right? So we are all sitting in our own offices.
I would say, as somebody that sits in the market, if you could fill this auditorium with people in the market to listen to what you were talking about and how they can... The interesting bit about your speech in particular was that the market is now driven by quants. Quants like to have something that they can model and they can feel and they can understand. So getting that message across, particularly with the way that you were describing the impact and the evolution of that equation, would resonate a lot. But I'm telling you now, none of them look at climate change in that way at all. So part of doing things like this, why I think, and the firm thinks it's important, is because the level of education and understanding is extraordinarily high in a room like this. But as soon as you come out of this room, people like little sound bites, easy routes, don't want to think about the hard things. And certainly, as we've seen in politics in Germany and the US over the last couple of weeks, people take the easy route, right? That water analogy again.
I think that economists play such an important role. So I think you mentioned you're a trade economist. So one of the big issues I think that really worries me on trade is things like CBAMs and what the impact that it's going to have on developing countries. So this is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And there's a lot of debate amongst economists about which countries will be impacted most. And that's where we really need to understand that so that we can, on the policy side and the financial side, be responding to that as well.
I can talk a lot about that, and I will be dominating the panel, so I don't want to do it, but you're absolutely right. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we can just get some questions from the audience, and they will find ways to make the discussion more positive. Sorry.
Thank you all for such an interesting discussion so far. And I have a question, perhaps directed to Professor Chiavari, but I'm curious to hear from all of you. So the model that you presented about trying to bring in the social cost of carbon, the way I see it is that in some ways we've been applying this model and we've been applying the social cost of carbon with just like a discount factor of 0 or discount rate of 0%. A future value of the negative harms of the large construction. So, do you agree that it's just kind of figure out how to set the discount rate? That's one of the most essential parameters. And if so, how to do this? And if not, what are the other things that matter more?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think this is a very important question. It goes a bit back to what you were saying. So this was meant to be a general audience talk, so I rather simplify many things, but the discount factor tells you how to trade off interests of present generation with future generation that are not yet here to vote, and so on and so forth. There's a bit of a Pandora box because it's not just a number and how you measure it, but it's a bit of a philosophical question, what as a society value. And I don't think I'm the person to tell you which is the number. This is part of a broader discussion. But I also think that there is the intellectual aspect of measuring the social cost of carbon, and I think there's a lot of power, at least in discipline, part of the policymaking discussion. But on the other hand, I mean, we don't have carbon taxing, practically speaking, anywhere. Policymakers don't like them. The way they like to introduce it is to build up markets to trade emissions, and then like this works very similarly to a carbon price. Ex ante seems a much more complicated thing to do than tax carbon. Ex post, they like that more, so very good. They do it, we're not even there at the right price. So I think, yeah, we need the right numbers, but there is also some chain of communication or some priority building that is at the very low level at this stage, because we are not there like, okay, is it correct that tax I'm putting is 180 or 185, Andrea? No, it's like, how do we put carbon taxes? How do we let countries start? So far, it's practically speaking only the European Union. China has started. It is a bit different, so we like it a bit less, but since everyone goes for this market building, at least they started, and this is the biggest cost. So there is room for improving, but yeah, anyway.
So I will ask one question from the online audience. You said in your keynote that, Andrea, the policy has to be global, but this is highly unlikely. And the question is about what about clubs of countries working together? Maybe this is a question for all panelists. So would Climate Club work?
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I will redirect also a bit towards you, but let me start. So the big friction is, yes, it's global, but countries don't love each other. So that's the big friction. And you need to have politicians to coordinate on things so there are plenty of frictions. So what these climate clubs do is that they try to bring incentives into a structure of power where some big players coordinate in a way that they impose tariffs on trade based on not on the amount of goods but the amount of emissions, to try to put the incentives they have internally externally to other players. And this goes like, for example, how is the cost that we'll have on developing countries that rely heavily on trade to grow and all these things. On the other hand, seems a very creative strategy to put people that don't agree to agree in an indirect way. So perhaps, I mean, Banu is really a trade economist, so she may have something more to say about what the European Union is going to say on CBAM, but
yeah,
maybe not.
Okay. I mean, climate club, if there's a climate club, it really has to be global, so no one has to be left out of it, because otherwise there's what we will call leakage. So there will always be another country. If there's a country that is outside the club, there will always be someone to leak the emissions to. This is going to simply reduce the effectiveness and efficiency of the carbon club. So it's not only about taxing imposing taxes on other countries, but climate clubs also provide incentives, positive incentives to be part of the club. The trade-off is you want the climate club to be big, but at the same time, as it gets bigger, it becomes much more difficult to take decisions. So that's what we see. So it's a good example is World Trade Organization, and everyone is now talking about how to reform it, because obviously the things are not really working well at the World Trade Organization. So there's this big trade-off there. But yeah, I mean, the solution is global, but bureaucracy of it is not easy to handle.
So I won't add on to that because I totally agree, but I think it is important to note for the audience that, you know, if you look, say, at Sub-Saharan Africa has, the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa is less emissions than the UK. Mm-hmm. So we have to be realistic as well. And so a lot of my research is around the risks that they're facing, both on the physical risk and the transition side. And
they are facing huge risks.
Huge risks on both sides. So huge physical risks, but at the same time, huge transition risks as well, in a time when their economies, for some countries, are still at a fairly early stage of development. And so, you know, supporting them to still grow and develop, but make that transition is so important. And that's why the new collective quantified goal that's being negotiated today in Baku is so important.
So I would say the good news is the financial market has a model for whether clubs or global works, and clubs don't work. So it needs to be global. And the financial markets model is regulation. So if you have The EEA has MiFID and MiFIR as their regulatory oversight. The firm that I run is overseen by the FCA. It's incredibly difficult to get that regulation and to keep it. But the simple fact is that if you don't want to have that regulation and you don't want to keep it, you go up and set up in Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands, where you can give anybody any leverage they want in any product with no oversight and no protection. So we call it regulatory arbitrage, and I think that you would see the same with the rules being arbitraged if you don't get everybody on board.
Exactly.
And in the real world, we see it in my world, we see it all the time. It's very hard to be regulated. It's very hard to be part of the club. But because you're not part of the club, you can go and do what you like. People go and do what they like.
Benefits.
That's what they do.
Okay, I don't see another question in the chat box. Yes.
Thank you. I'm a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute. My question is for Andrea. So, I'm not an economist, but for my PhD I did an version of the page integrated assessment model developed by Chris Hope at Cambridge, similar to guys. So I think probably when you explain the social cost of carbon dioxide, you go into discount rates in more detail, uncertainty as well, and net present value and so on. But there's this question on whether how economics is fit or not to current problems, and some people say K-12 or Stone economics might be a better approach and all that, and the critical role of transdisciplinary research is something that economics needs to be a part of. There might be some shortcomings to prepare to answer those questions. So my question is, how do you think the economic curricula here at Oxford, or more broadly, good question, and how do you think it can better prepare itself to deal with climate? Because when you present a curve and it doesn't have an uncertainty to students, to me as a researcher, that's worrisome, and not you precisely, more broadly. So uncertainty should always be there when you're talking about climate change. And my question is, how better can we work together as a community to incorporate that into economic thinking?
That's a nice, easy question for you.
Yes. So going backward, on the uncertainty, you're 100% right. Like, there is only as much as I want to explain about standard errors in a 30-minute talk for the general public, so I allow myself some flexibility at my talk. But
Referee may ask.
yes, there were some stars last time I saw. But joking apart, these things are very important. There is uncertainty about it. Going back to the discount factor, going back to how we measure damages, as she was also saying, and there are deep model uncertainty as well. So that is all there. I think this goes slightly beyond the policy discussion per se, but allows me to go back to your initial part of the question about the curriculum, which I'm not going to discuss here, although this is surprisingly interdisciplinary university, which I could benefit myself because I started only 3 years ago to work on climate change. So I had a lot to catch up with, and I could go around. There are different schools interrelated to the Department of Economics. At the Department of Economics, we have our environmental seminar, which is coordinated with Geography School, Martin School, Smith School. So, I mean, I'm doing a lot of advertisement to other schools as well. So, I think us as a science, we are very generous in absorbing from other fields. So as soon as we are shown that this or that, it's very useful. Historically, not only in climate, we have been very fast. Like I think economics looks much different than it was looking 30 years ago, which was a couple of equations, and that's it. So I stop here, but I think this is very important. I think we do our best, and we are always open to learn.
Thanks for the panel and talk. Question for David. You talked a lot about sort of knowledge, lack of knowledge, but also the creativity of markets. So on one hand, that feels like if allocators and investment managers and financiers just have more information, they might find that alpha that's out there. On the other hand, you think that we need a stick. So one stick that deals with knowledge is the SFDR and its articles. I'm sort of of the opinion, though, that its aim is slightly of its problem. It's trying to speed up the process that we will need, including explain well the stick. But in doing so, it's hampering creativity. Things that are maybe sustainable and are finding sustainable alpha are falling outside of the articles. Maybe not into completely outside of it, but Article 9 rather than Article 8, sorry, Article 8 rather than Article 9, etc. So how should policymakers, from a market perspective, balance the need for a market both to be creative, but also to be regulated to move quickly enough?
So again, for me, the answer to that is that the carrot and stick still works. So you need to create an environment where the politics and the investor and the thought process of the public in general is aligned, so that the financial markets work out how to create product that makes it relevant to the requirements. So if you're a hedge fund, if you're a venture capitalist, if you're an investment bank that's selling to its clients, the reality is that you're not producing the money that's being invested. That investment funds are coming from end clients. They will be the ones that dictate the product that you evolve and develop. They will be the ones that tell you what they want it to do. So really, again, for me, the financial market can be hugely innovative, but it needs a reason to do it. And I still think, coming back to the other panelists' point, that politically and socially, personally, I think we need to be a lot more honest about it. Everybody is driven by election cycles. Everybody is driven by a constantly changing narrative, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks. People's mind will be changed because they think they're going to get something they want from it. If the public and politics, by virtue of being driven by that public opinion, is there and engages and takes on the macro view that they have to do something, it's going to be painful. There are going to be changes. There are things that we need to absorb in everyday life to make it happen. Then the water will flow, and the investment banks, the hedge funds, the public offices, venture capitalists, everybody will be extraordinarily quick to evolve ways of putting money to work in a very creative way. But at the moment, the thing you have to realise is everything that the financial market does is driven by investor demand in one way or another. And unless the investor is sitting there beating their bankers around with a stick, saying, you're not giving me what I want, give me what I want because this is what I'll invest in for the next 20 years, they're not going to do it.
Can I just add a point on that as well, around sort of the role of regulation at the moment? So correct me if you feel differently, but a lot of the financial things that are happening in the financial domain right now are around information. Yeah. So we're not actually putting any sticks on them at all, really. So it's around information to enable an investor, if they wish to decide to invest in sustainable versus not sustainable. And that all sort of came down to this theory around, the time that TCFD was formulated, that, and the famous quote by Mark Carney, the more we invest with foresight, the less we regret with hindsight. That's it. That's all we've got at the moment. We've only got information, and we're sort of generating bucket loads of information. But you're right. Unless the investor cares, the information won't necessarily do anything.
And I would say something about regulation as well. Regulation tends to be something that's constantly trying to play catch up. So if you look at financial regulation in the UK, the FCA 15, 20 years ago got left behind and was a very ineffectual regulator, in my opinion. And there's no lack of correlation that coincided with this huge leap in technology which allowed investor access. So as that technology curve has flattened off a bit, what you found is that the regulators caught up because the innovation slowed down a bit. And if you think about climate stuff, the regulator will always be behind, and he won't be a help. At the beginning, he'll be a hindrance because he's still thinking about what was going on for the last 5 years. But what you'll find is that, I agree with you, most regulation at the moment is about consumer protection. So the FCA have brought in consumer duty, for example. So consumer duty is not there to make it easier for the financial market. It actually makes it considerably harder. And I think that comes down to that education point and how politics engages. Regulators are run by politicians as well. So, all of this conversation to me goes back to the end user, the investor, the guy in the street. He needs to be better informed, and he needs to take a view that influences the way that he votes, that gets politicians in there that actually want to do something in the long term. It's like listening to an episode of The West Wing, right? It's perfect and it looks great, but it's just not the way the world works. It's incredibly difficult, I think. But none of this starts in the financial market. The financial market is a tool that responds to the environment around it. It doesn't do it on its own.
So here's one question from online audience. So I think this applies to all of you. From your experience, are banks convinced to take action on emissions in their loan portfolios by seeing transition risk models and their implications for default risks, or to encourage climate adaptation for small firms by seeing outcomes of models of physical risks? So this is about how we communicate what we do. David?
Again, I'm not going to be very positive about that, right? I think they can, and they will in the right circumstances, but they're very much driven by what goes on around them, right? So they're never going to innovate. I keep coming back to that point. You can't look at the financial market to innovate. If Barclays Bank announces its end-of-year annual finances, you'll get a nice glossy portfolio. It will show you charts of what it's done, how the business has grown, and there'll be half a dozen pages that will talk about how it's looking at its sustainability, how it's looking at its green footprint, how it's doing social programs to offset, and all the rest of it. So that booklet, let's say it costs 20 quid to produce, needs to be paid for. How's it getting paid for? It's getting paid for by a bunch of people sitting on the trading floor that are selling ESG products that are raising fees that aren't ESG products at all. They're just kicking it out the door to the investor because the investor has stopped thinking about or is not given the opportunity to think about what he's buying. It's a very virtuous circle.
Maybe I can try and say something positive.
Please do.
Go ahead.
So
we need that.
I'll try. So we did some research a couple of years ago. So a couple of years ago, the Bank of England ran its first climate stress test. So this is where they required the largest, I think, 22 banks and insurers to analyse the impacts of climate change on their portfolio, both the physical risk and the transition risk.
Yeah.
And they provided a set of scenarios to allow them to do that. And we did a piece of research where we went and spoke to all of the banks and insurers that were involved about, how did you do this? What impacts did it have? Has it changed the way you're thinking about this? And what we found is that actually did have quite a big impact. So the fact that the Bank of England had required them to do this, the biggest impact was it upskilled them significantly. So they had upskilled in how to use data, how to interpret the models. They'd briefed their board, so the boards were being formed. There'd been discussion at board level about this. This was just a first step. I think where we didn't see as much action is it wasn't necessarily feeding into frontline decision making.
But this is exactly my point, right? So everybody embraces the idea. What did they do about it?
Well, it was only the first step, though.
Good for
but
them.
I would say
how many years ago was that?
It's only 2.
Okay, only 2. They've still been doing what they do.
Well, the other thing I was to say is the thing that I heard about when it really makes a difference. What makes a difference is reputational risk. So the banks are really worried about being, caught with their trousers down, shall we say, in financing.
Then you come back to that jurisdiction. You come back to the jurisdiction arbitrage, right? So let's say one of the big 4 banks in the UK does something silly and everybody hates them and goes away and wants to move their account. Where are they moving it to? Another bank? Is that bank still doing what they're doing? You go to a start-up bank that's getting fined. Metro got fined £16 million by the FCA this week for AML problems. How can you be a bank that's still having AML problems? They can't sort out how to onboard and manage
anti-money laundering.
Anti-money laundering. Sorry, but if they can't sort out the basics of their business, how much attention do you honestly think the board's going to worry about their carbon footprint of every branch that they've got in the country? It's PR, it's perception and reality, and I just carrot and stick. Get your sticks out. You guys need to help the government get sticks. Because once you force these people, they will become an incredible power for good.
If I can add another positive point, is that I think we all, as consumers of financial products, can make a big difference.
It's like I said to the previous question,
yeah,
right?
So my lovely in-laws recently came to me a few months ago and said, we want to do something to help climate change. We're going to plant a tree for each of our grandchildren. That's lovely, but talk to your pension fund about where they're putting their money.
Exactly.
And I think that's if we can all stand together and say, where are you putting my money? Is it financing something that's positive for my future? And we all have that power.
Absolutely. And remember, every single thing that happens in a financial market is driven by an end person taking his £10 that his son's given him, he's given his son for Christmas, and sticking it in a savings account, and they're looking for a return. That's where you start. That's to my opinion.
But in order for those to know what is going on, first big players will have to take an action.
Yeah.
So for big change, that will come from like smaller players, but the initiative, the start, should come from the bigger guys.
But all the time that you have, particularly in the West, election cycles, where in 4 years' time everybody's fed up with higher green taxes, and somebody comes along and says, I can solve that by waving my hand and throwing a shiny thing at you and it'll all be great, and they vote for him, you start again, right? So that honesty of a macro view of what's going on with the planet, with the world, with the economy, and the costs that are associated with it, it needs to get out there. And I think it's incredibly tough to do that, but that's where you need to change it.
Can I add another positive thing, which the two of you as economists are very welcome to argue with? So one other positive thing. So you were seeing, is it yesterday that Keir Starmer announced a goal for 81% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in the UK by 2030.
30, I think. Yeah.
So that's ambitious, and it is on where we need to go. So when I was working in government 20 years ago, we were trying to make the case for a 60% reduction by 2050. So, it's come on such a long way. And the reason that it has come on such a long way is because the costs of renewables are coming down much more quickly than anyone thought they would. We've made transitions across many sectors much more quickly than we thought was possible. So that whole equation on what is actually possible and feasible has changed so much.
So regulation plus private incentives or market incentives.
Is it net carbon neutral?
Yes.
So isn't the operative word net?
Well, it's what they're going to do on the offset side, but I think the UK is good on that compared to others.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you very much to all of you, and there are positives and negatives.
I'm sorry, I apologize again.
But the good news is I think we all have some suggestions about where to go, and everyone is ready to take their part, and maybe next time we should bring together representatives from financial sector, David, and do something similar. Just think about it.
Do it, right?
In fact, the two that you mentioned.
Well, I would say, just full disclosure, Barclays are our bankers, so I should be nicer to them.
But thank you very much all for joining us today, both in person and online. And once again, huge thanks to our panelists. And keep watching our What Economists Really Do series. Thank you.